Ah, I see you have a radar detector. Didn't you hear me coming? In 2006, I lost a good friend to pancreatic cancer, and he was in the prime of his life. LAPD officer, did triathlons, went to the gym 2 or 3 hours a day, and super fit. When we found out that he had pancreatic cancer, it really impacted me in the way that I was thinking about how I was living my life. I was pretty much just going to work every day and coming home and resting enough to work another 16-hour shift. And then in 2008, I had a wake up call. I had right branch bundle block. I went and saw my doctor, and he said, I have some heart issues. I need to cut back on the amount that I'm working. And then that same year, I lost a good friend to suicide. I start looking at my life and saying, there's some things that I want to accomplish while I'm here. I definitely want to spend some more time with my family, not work as much, and find that work-life balance. So in 2015, I was waiting for our car to be built from Tesla, and with these events happening in my life, I really wanted to set a Guinness Book of World Record. It was a dream since I was in grade school, leafing through the school library and looking at all these crazy records people set. And I knew I wasn't going to grow the world's longest fingernails or smoke the most cigarettes because I'm a really health nut. I looked into what the shortest charging time was across country and thought this could be broken. And if we play it right, we might be able to set the lowest time across country. So I reached out to Guinness, and they told us what evidence we would need. We brought 3 witnesses along. They rode in a separate vehicle, and some of those videos are on YouTube. People can watch them. It was a life-changing event because it was that great America road trip, cross country, in a vehicle with friends, and really pushing to how far you could drive and stay awake, and then switch over to the passenger seat and let somebody fresh drive. And it was a great event, but I had no idea how it would change my life. Since that time, I've set 9 other world records, some of them very granular, but in a couple Guinness Book of World Records. I hold the Guinness record for the greatest distance on a motorcycle in 24 hours. And of course, we hold the shortest charging time in an electric vehicle. But along the way, I found out about a charity that takes veterans on 5-day motorcycle journeys. And these are veterans that are suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it gives them an opportunity to decompress and ride motorcycles 8 hours a day, and the charity doesn't have any administrative costs. So every dollar goes towards keeping these guys out there and having fun, and just letting them know that they're appreciated as veterans. And they have some counseling in the evening where the counselors give them some tools in their toolbox to deal with the things that they struggle with. Some of them have struggles with sleeping at night, and yet others have, issues with anger management, things like that. And this is a great outlet. Get on a motorcycle, release some dopamine and some serotonin naturally. And so I feel compelled every year to go out and set 1 or 2 nutty records to get them some press. I don't get paid from the charity, and I'm not on their board. I just feel like an ambassador to put the good word out. So one of my craziest car stories was in 2016. Dina Tracy, Alex Roy, and myself took the knowledge that we had from the previous Tesla record and set the self-driving record from coast to coast. Delphi had originally had that record at 9 days. I had done some research on their route, looked at the improvements that Tesla was making, and just waiting for them to release their first version of autopilot. We raced across the country in autopilot and managed to set a lower time on autopilot than we had the previous year driving the car ourselves. So again, 2 records in one shot. But coming through Kansas, I was behind the wheel. Alex Roy was in the back seat, and Dina was in the passenger side. People that have Teslas know the ceramic windshield doesn't allow for the Valentine 1 to work very good through the windshield. And an officer was coming the other way over a little knoll, and they lit us up. So my policy is I generally just pull over right away and take my medicine. It does 2 things. It lets the officer know that you're being compliant, and it also takes some of the anxiety from the officer knowing that they're not going to have to give chase. They don't have to do multitasking like running your plate while they're waiting to pull you over. So I pull over, the lady officer comes up to the window, and says, I see you have a radar detector. Didn't you hear me coming? And I explained to her about the ceramic windshield. I found that the best way to get out of tickets is to ask a calculated question to the officer. So when they're asking me for my license and registration, I'm obviously getting that information for them. But I ask them, how fast do you normally pick up people on this stretch of road? And she proceeded to tell me, well, just last Saturday night, we got somebody doing 115. And I thought, wow, 110 doesn't sound so bad then. And she kind of stepped back, wasn't expecting that for the moment, and then chuckled to herself. And I handed her the information, and she was asking about the electronics in the vehicle and the display. And I had explained to her that we were testing the autopilot feature. And she says, I wasn't aware that that was even legal for the road. She said, my husband would love to see this car. Meanwhile, Alex Roy's filming the whole thing in the back. She goes back to her car. She comes back and she says, you folks have a good evening and just slow down. So the record that I'm most known for is setting the Cannonball record on 2 wheels. Now everyone knows that Ed Boyan holds the record in a 4-wheel automobile, but the record for the 2-wheel record had not been broken in 32 years. So I started a long planning process, and I consulted with Ed, talked to him on the phone, and he gave me some really good tips for how to do this safely. One thing I looked at is that everyone that had tried it within the last few years failed to do a sleep stop. And they pushed themselves, but then they would get to Pennsylvania or Ohio, lay down on a picnic table and end up falling asleep and sleeping right through any alarms that they had set. So the record hadn't been broken since 1983. George Egloff had set that record with a record of 42 hours flat. And it was a strong record. Anyone knows that you ride a motorcycle for 5-6 hours, you get tired. So I started changing my diet. I gave up coffee, tea, and sugar 8 weeks before the run, started purging myself from caffeine. I didn't want to do it on any stimulants. I just figured that if it's an endurance record, I want to see how long my body can endure. So I did some test runs and found out that I can drive about 17 hours before I start to fade. And so at 17 hours, I planned a sleep stop in Kansas. I had arranged a hotel to be set up in Salina, Kansas that I was aware of, that I knew exactly where it was at right off the freeway, and pulled in there and pulled the electronics off of the bike. Wasted some time pulling the electronics off, but the receptionist told me that they had a lot of theft in that area over the last few past weekends and that it would be smart to pull those things. I took a shower, ate a half of a sandwich, slept for about an hour and 15 minutes, then put everything back on the bike. That second leg was very, very difficult. The sun still wasn't up yet, and I was feeling the fatigue. I had some sleep inertia where my eyes were still burning from the short sleep cycle. But as the sun came up, I started catching my second wind, and then I met with Greg Ledette in Ohio, and he led me through a good portion of Ohio, and very grateful to have him on the team. We actually, in the pre-planning process, had set up about 7 people to give me assistance in driving and scouting ahead for me, is going through all those states. And I managed to get on the turnpike in Pennsylvania. As I was coming through an underpass in a long straight, I looked back behind me and I could see that the grass was worn down, and by a pile of gravel there was an officer shooting long ways into people's backs, and there was no radar to bounce back to my bike. So again, my MO is that I just grab a lot of brake and pull to the side of the road, and the officer didn't even put his lights on. He just rolled up on the shoulder really slow and came up to me and asked me why I pulled over. And I said, because you got me. And he says, you're right, I did. He said, but actually my radar gun was on the seat as you went by, and you saw me first because you were on your brakes as I was reaching for the gun. And by the time I pulled up, I clocked you doing 110 and a 65. And he wanted to know what the reason why I was going so fast. And I said, well, there's a production company waiting for this bike in New York City. And he looked at me with disbelief. So when I handed him my license and my registration, I handed him also the business card for the production company I had hired to film my arrival in New York. And he looks at it and he says, okay, I'll be right back. And he says, but wait a second. Why doesn't this bike have a license plate on it? And I said, well, in California, when you buy a new bike, they don't give you the license plate right away. It comes in the mail. And he says, well, you bought this bike 2 months ago. And I'm like, well, it might be lost in the mail. I'm not sure. And then he knocked on the fuel cell, 8.5 gallon fuel cell that was on the back seat. And he says, what's this? And I said, it's an extra fuel tank. And he says, so you don't have to stop? And I'm like, well, yeah, I still have to stop, but it gets me a little bit further down the road. He shakes his head again. He walks back. He comes back and he says, I'm giving you a warning. It's an $80 ticket and it's an open-end vehicle code violation on the turnpike. It could mean that you littered or it could mean that you were speeding. It's kind of a catch-all. I have a motorcycle and I like to drive it fast too. And he says, I'm retiring in a couple weeks, so I don't really need to meet any quotas. So let's just slow down a little bit. And he said, do you have any questions for me? And I said, yeah, can you give me an escort to the New York line? He went, no, absolutely not. I got to go on another call. So he tears me off the warning, says, pay the $80 in 30 days and we're good. So we decided we want to make a documentary to tell about the stories of the 100-year history of motorcycle Cannonball. And the documentary is not about myself as much as it is about all of the guys that have set the motorcycle record, from Cannonball Baker, who is the inspiration for Brock Yates's movie, The Cannonball Run. And each one of these guys has an interesting story, but one common thread in the documentary is that each one of these guys had an event that slowed them down. One guy lost a screw in his headlight, and the headlight aimed 90 degrees straight down on his front tire through the night going through Oklahoma, and he couldn't make any time along Route 66 back in the 60s. Other guys got bit by a dog. I mean, everyone has a story, but that American spirit to persevere, overcome, and complete the journey. They're really inspiring stories, so it's an interesting documentary, and we hope to release that next spring.
Whether you're packing for a cannonball or just going about your day, it's important to just carry what you actually need. The Ridge has a line of wallets and bags that help you to do just that. Leave the junk at home and just make sure that you've always got exactly what you need with you. So be sure to check out ridge.com/VinWiki and use the code VinWiki at checkout for a discount to let them know how much you appreciate their support of the VinWiki channel.